Yeah, hi to anyone watching, either at the moment or later. I decided this evening to do a stream on the migrant crisis 10 years ago in Europe. Um, but I mean, it's a migrant crisis for the migrants as much as it is for any nation that was receiving them. Um, and actually, at the time, I was cycling in the region of the Balkans. So yeah, let's just have a look at a map. So yeah, let's get into the meat of it really. I had cycled over from Germany at this point across Austria, Slovenia, Croatia. I'd been in Bosnia, which was quite an amazing experience up until this point. Actually, to celebrate my birthday that year, I was going to meet up with a close friend of mine in Belgrade. And Belgrade is a city I know quite well. I have a number of contacts, especially in those days in Serbia. So I was really looking forward to getting back into the country, and familiarity sometimes really serves you well in terms of looking for things to do and people to meet and these things. So I'd been over the mountains. I've been over a number of mountain ranges by this point. I'd come over what are known as the Chalk Alps on to the east of Austria. And then I'd also crossed over some pretty intense mountain ranges across in the Balkans, from the north to the south, and the border crossing, in fact, with Herzegovina here and Montenegro is also quite spectacular. It's at reasonably high altitude. And then I spent a few days, maybe up to a week in Montenegro before deciding to take my route to Belgrade. So at this point, I must be honest, despite the fact I do enjoy reading the news, it is one of my, should we say, hobbies. I had decided to, I just wasn't really reading the news all that much. So I wasn't taking in the nature and the local cultures, and admittedly a lot of the food. I do recommend the cheeses in this region especially. And so I'd been a bit detached from world politics and such like. So I'd arrived in Belgrade. Remember, it's pretty late evening. I had contacts in Belgrade that I could have stayed with, but I didn't want to interrupt them effectively almost in the middle of the night. And I knew there was a hostel I could stay at, and which would be a bit less intrusive on my friends in Belgrade, to stay in a hostel as opposed to just crashing at their place randomly in the middle of the night. And when I got to the hostel, I mean, I really noticed it the next morning that the guests there were, they looked like real hardcore backpackers, people that have been trekking. And I thought, okay, well, this is this could well be possible. And I mentioned this to the owners. They laughed at me and said, "These aren't backpackers; these are refugees." There's a massive movement of people at this point moving across the Balkans, and they're moving northwards. In fact, in Belgrade, in the center, they were setting up migrant camps. And I say they, I mean the state of Serbia, in all fairness, was treating them with a lot of respect. They let them camp and stay for a couple of days in the center of Belgrade. They even let them sleep in the train station. And given my hostel was just down the road, and in the end I started staying, I spent another week staying at my friend's place. She was away for a week later than that, so I stayed for a few weeks. But she let me stay in her place because in the end I started working with some of the local charities there, making friends, playing football with the children. And yeah, I felt the need to try and understand what was going on. And I actually tried to contact a number of newspapers. They didn't reply to me. I noticed when they came to interview people there, they seemed very distant, those who even came. I'm sure a lot of them wrote from their armchairs. They didn't seem to really make any contact with the people there. As you will see, I mean, superficially it looks like quite a rough and ready camp, but people were very friendly then. I had no problems with any of my items being stolen or feeling any lack of trust in the people there. I got to know quite a few of the families. And the point I want to make is also that I've kept contact with a number of the people that I saw traveling northwards. So yeah, just to have one last look at the map before we look at some pictures that I took. Yeah, this is the location in the Balkans for those who are not so geographically aware. And for the route the migrants took, they would go to Turkey, and they were taking a treacherous crossing with the boat to Greece. And some of these islands were where they'd land first. You don't do this for fun. You don't risk your life for fun. Many of these people were refugees from Syria. There were economic migrants as well, but there's a grey, blurry line between the two. And they would go to Greece and then move through Macedonia. The police were pretty harsh in Macedonia, they said. And then enter Serbia. And Serbia, on the whole, treated them with respect. They gave them transit visas. But Hungary, well, that's something else. Perhaps we'll speak about that as we start looking at the pictures and getting some more visual reference to what's going on there. To give you a context with my bike, a bit like the last stream I did, this was how my bike looked. Not all that exciting. Well, it depends on who you are, but my guitar was still there. Music was very much a part of this trip. It's the same bike, Novi Sad. Again, named after a city in northern Serbia, so it was going to... Eventually I'd go back to Novi Sad after being in Belgrade on this trip, before cycling back to Germany. Again, having the camera at the front, it's just so quick to stop and get a picture when your camera is so accessible by having it on the handlebar. This isn't some phone camera that I'm using. Photography is a keen interest of mine. And yeah, this bike had been by this point, up to the Polar Circle and to Ukraine already by this point, France, been to a number of places. So this was 2015, and so the last stream I did was about 2017, so I hadn't yet done that trip to Armenia. Yeah, so to give you an idea of where I had been, this is the Chalk Alps in Austria, so I had to pass over this at some point. Although the roads are pretty straightforward in Austria, it looks harder than it actually is. Just another random picture I decided to throw in there. I didn't want to go into too much detail about this Balkan trip, but yeah, playing a game of chess, and this was in Croatia, where chess is quite the favoured pastime. And this guy let me stay at his place. Another one of those, strangers that like to chat with other strangers. And I think he beat me, to be honest. But I don't mind. And this is one of the first pictures. I can't remember all the names of the people. I remember their characters and their personalities. It's sad, actually. I didn't get some pictures of the people that meant the most to me. People first and refugee second. Let's put it that way. They were asking me where they thought was best to go at this point. Most of them thought that Germany was best. So already by this point, Angela Merkel had come out with the sentence, "Wir schaffen das," I think was what she said, which means we'll get this done. We can welcome these people. So it was about 800,000 refugees and migrants that Germany accepted in 2015. So I'm not really following chronology here, but by the winter of that year, people did die queuing to get their papers. This is the land of bureaucracy after all. And yeah, it was a difficult time for German bureaucracy, but also, for, of course, for the migrants coming here. Germany did reach a breaking point. And I say this with all fairness to everybody concerned. It's not always about money, it's about resources, and you can't just magically conjure them up from nowhere. And this is an aspect that touches on the politics of migration, about open borders and the notion of just letting everybody go everywhere. It's not about the morality, it's about the practicality and actionability of policy. And I say this with a heavy heart because people like these two guys, I believe they were both from Syria, they didn't choose to be born in a war zone. They didn't choose to have to flee a country that they're probably quite happy to live in. And whilst fleeing, finding the country that they would end up in, and not knowing what would end up to them. No one gets to choose these things. It's quite an unfortunate situation one finds themselves in, and I'm fortunate enough to have been born in a peaceful country and be able to live in a peaceful country without too many problems. That's a luck thing. That's not earned. So, yeah, the German system did nevertheless struggle, and that's not fair on anybody. And Sweden also pulled their weight with regards to helping refugees and migrants in Europe. I would say the UK didn't in this case, quite like it had done, for example, during the Balkan wars of the 90s. It did perhaps a little more than it did in the case of the Syrian civil war. So yeah, just to exemplify, in Belgrade, the authorities were providing water on a daily basis, clean drinking water for the migrant camp. That's quite spontaneously developed in the center of Belgrade. And I have to give respect to the Serbian authorities. When I interviewed, because as I say, I had the interest of sharing my understanding and experience with, to put it in a nutshell, mainstream media, mainstream newspapers, I started interviewing people. And when I interviewed the local Serbs, they were saying, well, we know about difficult times. And whilst I didn't want to contradict, or not contradict, but say, well, it's a little bit more complicated what happened in the Balkan Wars, it is true that there were a lot of Serbian refugees that came into Serbia from Croatia. It was a very messy civil war what happened after Yugoslavia collapsed. And they took a positive light from this and said, we're going to help the migrants. We understand that suffering occurs. We need to help. So a lot of the locals were very, very courteous and considerate about giving these people a sense of calm, because the countries they'd come from and the countries they already knew from the news where they were going to were not necessarily quite as welcoming. And I mean Hungary in this case. So they relaxed in Serbia, which was also an opportunity in which to chat and get to know these people, and share contact details, because I was, wanted to help, not just at this point, but especially if they ended up in Germany. And that's just what happened with, let's say, a number of people. So there were a lot of children, and you will see in these pictures, I mean, they're quite photogenic, and I was playing football with them. And the resilience of the children was quite amazing. The parents would often worry, like there's a thunderstorm and heavy rain one night. And because of, at this point, my friend, one of my best friends, was staying with me in Belgrade for my birthday. And we were staying in this flat of my friend, and said, well, hey, we've got loads of space here, and they're all out there sleeping in the rain. So we invited a lot of refugees to come and stay in the flat we were living in. I remember one guy, Emmett, he liked other men and couldn't live in Serbia anymore as a gay man. He felt also threatened because of this. And then there was another family in our flat with us, with a number of children. I tried to make sure that the children were given somewhere to stay that night. The funny thing is, the resilience of the children was quite exemplary. They would play in the rain while the parents were worried about the wet, and didn't fully understand, I think, the context for a lot of good that they were in. And this picture exemplifies the contrast between, some Serbs just enjoying the warm summer's day. This would have been around my birthday, which is in September time at this point, so it was well underway. And then these refugees who were fleeing, and I mean, they'd walked most of the way. They would sometimes try and get transport when they could, but they spent a lot of money, sadly, to give these gangs that transported them across the oceans, which we're talking thousands of euros, and most of their life savings they would spend on this. So they were very spendthrift in terms of moving northwards, and when they could, sometimes it would require ID, and they'd lost their ID. Sometimes they would intentionally lose their ID. This is also true. The economic migrants, for example, from Pakistan, would of course get rid of their ID and then pretend they were from other countries. Again, what am I meant to say? Just because Pakistan is not really a war-torn country, it's still a difficult life in comparison with what I know. I don't want to pass judgment too harshly. But it did cause them problems, understandably. So they walked. Some of them walked the entire way. And this was at the train station, so sometimes they would see if they could get a train. The other issue was that Hungary wasn't really letting them across the border. What is becoming there's a bit of a staccato type movement of people across the border at this point. And so the train companies didn't want them going on the trains because they wouldn't be accepted into Hungary, and they would check the documents and they'd stall the trains to stop them coming across the border. So every day they would go to this train station. There's the train station in the middle of Belgrade, and try and negotiate and find if they could get a ticket on the train. A little easier than walking, I'd say. And this was me 10 years ago on my cycling trip. So this is quite a sad picture. In fact, this is a very sad picture. And this is the kind of thing that doesn't get spoken about. So of this group, these two boys on the left are brothers. And they eventually ended up in the Netherlands. Sadly, they were split. They were not allowed to stay together. They were fostered in two different families because they couldn't prove that they were brothers. And they didn't have a choice. I don't even think at this point they knew where they would end up, in which country they would end up, let alone the fact that they'd be split into two. I learned this from Emmett later on, who was friends with these two. So I think these two also stayed in the flat where my friend and I were staying in Belgrade. So these are the things that you don't get to hear about, the difficulties of being either migrant or refugee. And I'm pretty sure they were from Syria because Emmett being from Syria and knowing their families. There's a lot of upheaval, a lot of uncertainty, and sometimes choices are taken out of your hands that you would think are quite rudimentary. Staying with your brother. That's we take these things for granted, don't we? So I think we go backwards now. Yeah, so I mean, this is another picture of the train station. It was also a makeshift place for people to sleep overnight that didn't have tents. A lot of people did have tents, but of course tents got lost, barbed wire and running across these borders, difficulties. And there's a lot of solemn faces there, quite a bit of sadness. Yeah, that's not the whole picture that as you'll see. And there was crime going on, but I didn't see any of the migrants committing these crimes or refugees committing these crimes. At least I'm assuming that these guys were Serbs, and they were shouting in Serbian. It was because of the police shouting at these people that I noticed and tried to get a picture. So. And here you can see that there's an aid agency handing out food. This is who I ended up spontaneously helping with. And they were generally well fed there. They were really cared for. It wasn't just the state. The state accepted them, but the aid agencies really pushed and made sure that they were comfortable. In fact, they got a sound system there, and you'll see some people moving like they were dancing, and that's because they were doing exactly that. So sometimes we would have spontaneous parties pop up, and people had some fun, which is also not always a luxury in life. Sometimes fun is needed. And the police, I remember seeing the police for the first time come over when the music was playing, and I was thinking, oh, something's going to happen here. All they said was, hey, look, after 9:30, 10, let's turn the music off. But they were very accepting. And again, you have to respect a state and authority when something so difficult as this is going on. But they were treated quite well. Playing. He'd taken his djembe with him. I knew this guy. I saw him almost every day when I was down at camp until, in the first week at least, yeah. And they were quite happy to have instruments, and we had a speaker system as well to play some music. And I think this is my favorite dancing picture. You could really feel the movement of the crowd. So it's good to see some happiness, and it all came together, the humanity of the time, the relaxation they could find in the solace in being in Serbia was a good thing. Yeah, and some of the people from the agencies were enjoying with in the dancing. I mean, it has to be said also that there weren't so many women involved in the partying and dancing. There seemed to be a level of segregation. This paternal culture, which we can't deny that that's part of the culture of a lot of these people, that they're coming from with these conservative roles, and you could see that. But there were quite a number of women among these groups, and as I say, with children. But there was also a lot of children moving alone. Some children lost their families on the way. So one family I knew, there were 3 girls, all underage, below 18, traveling northwards, and they ended up in Germany. And their family came later. And in fact, eventually all 8 of the children made their way to Germany. The last one to come, she was actually studying medicine in Aleppo and decided to stay on in Syria to make sure that she finished her medicine degree. And she's now a doctor in Germany. And this is the other thing that's not said so often, are the good news stories of people's lives in Germany. So of these 8 children, you have one that's studying to become a dentist, another one who's really into football and German rap and is very much immersed. I mean, his sister said to me, if they went back to Syria, he's staying here. He here is in Germany. And then the eldest sister became a doctor. So that goes against this kind of stereotype of what roles people take in these communities. And some of these positive stories, you hear about there's 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000 people who are have criminal mentalities, but you don't often hear about the good ones, and they're far more predominant among refugees and immigrants than the bad ones. Why would you be so motivated to move and make a better life? It's already a sign of a healthy mentality to do so. I knew another guy who moved to Berlin and started up a brewery. I'm a little bit concerned about his level of alcohol consumption, but it goes against, again, the misnomer that they're, the conservative Muslim background. I didn't come across this all too often. Although one man, his name I cannot remember, but I interviewed him. And he was very a conservative Muslim in many respects. But what's little known is that the Assad regime didn't really respect people for their religion. In fact, they would use it against them. So he ended up being tortured. I think he was quite against the regime. And this is a typical story I heard. So they burned the Quran in front of him. They knew he was quite a conservative Muslim, so they knew that would get to him. And then they started pulling his toenails out of his feet. This is what people were fleeing, at the very least. And I've heard of multiple cases of torture. So this man looked me in the eye and told me this story. It's a shame none of the newspapers at the time were interested in hearing about this and some of the detail and severity of what people were fleeing. Although I think the bigger picture in time has been drawn and shown. Yeah, so he made his way into Norway, and he now lives in a small village in Norway. And he seems very happy there. I think it suits him. So yeah, many good stories, good news stories, people who deserve to have somewhere better to stay, somewhere better to live. And whether it be Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, did do this and continue to do so. And we should be happy for both the country and these people. So these agencies, I mean, there was a lot of discussion about migrant rights at the time. I mean, by this point, hundreds had already died in the Mediterranean trying to cross to Greece. So there's a lot of emphasis on protesting about mistreatment of migrants. Serbia allowed them to protest, for good and for bad. We know at the moment, that there's been student protests in Serbia against their government. I'm not saying they're ideal or good or I'm not looking at the overall picture of Serbian politics here, but in this specific case, a little bit of respect has to be given. Didn't see things in black and white in cases like these. Yeah, so in English and in Serbian. And here you can see the police, they were often there and they would speak to the agencies and they would organize, when music could be played but they were relatively respectful and easy to talk to. And they allowed these protests to take place. Not too much of an issue. Yeah, and then there's the children playing, and they of course wouldn't understood what's written behind them, but I think it makes a point. Whatever you think of adults, children haven't chosen the lives they're leading, and are very malleable still, for good and for bad. And we need to try and be a good influence so that plasticity of their minds is shaped in a way that's favorable both for them and for the societies they're part of. There needs to be more differentiation between migrant children and migrants in general, in my opinion. When children have found themselves in these situations, there must be much more effort made. And I say this, and I'm thinking of France, for example, in northern France. I'm not too sure what's going on there now, but a few years ago there were still the migrant camps on the northern coast. I guess the media's got bored of reporting about it now. It's intentional, it's just not probably selling the papers they'd like. And so they don't report on that now. It was known as the jungle near Calais. Thousands of migrants in tents. Periodically the French authorities would push them out of these camps. So there are many countries guilty in many different ways of causing suffering. And there's children, many children among these camps. You have to think that these children in these pictures are now adults. This 10 years ago. Did we do the right thing? Do we do enough? You can talk about the economics, but is it really economically viable to not give an education to children or stability? I think there is an answer, though, that I know in Germany, that many children have had a lot of love and care, both from the state and from agencies. And I think a lot of these children, if they end up in Germany, this is a real compliment to Germany, they will have had a decent education. There's a lot of good news stories, and that isn't just, that takes effort on the part of states and people. I think these ladies were from Afghanistan. There was a number of Afghanis. In fact, I met one Afghani, but when he first spoke to me, I thought he was from Liverpool. He spoke with a Scouse accent. Just quite a strong and unique and flavoursome accent from the north of the UK. And he told me he'd lived in Liverpool for 10 years, which makes sense given the accent. And then he'd had heart difficulties and needed an operation and was deported around this time. He seemed rather genuine, and he wanted to make another go of trying to come back to Europe because he felt at home in Europe. It's quite sad that this had happened to this man at the time of ill health. So the Afghanis were also represented among this group. And again, more dancing. This style of dancing is actually, it's funny, it's actually quite common in the Balkans, and probably brought by the Ottoman Empire. It's a type of line dancing. It's common at weddings, at festivities. The Kurds have a similar type of dance. In Turkey, if you go to a wedding, they'll dance like this, and I think in Syria it's not too dissimilar. I'm surprised I didn't see more Serbs join in with the dancing, because it's the kind of thing you'd see at a wedding in Serbia. Yeah, so it's kind of familiar by this point. Phones were critical I mean, I wonder what, actually, in fact, what role they played in allowing people to really move with that level of flexibility, and that also being able to keep in contact with loved ones allowed one to be a bit more daring. It was at a time where it's just about affordable to have a smartphone. Not too sure what he wanted someone to be quiet about, but yeah, I mean, people were living out of tents, so that meant there was an area to wash and to shave. It wasn't an easy way to be. Although a lot of people, I think, had got used to it by this point. I'd spent weeks on foot. And a lot of people in Turkey also had built up some money and worked in Turkey. So Turkey overall has also, with Syrian refugees, been relatively considerate, although in the end they used them as a form of blackmail with the EU. Saying, we'll push more migrants your way if you don't do A, B, and C. So sometimes reasonable ends aren't always matched by the intent. Not the most virtuous intents there. I think this picture encapsulates the motion of many best. the exhaustion, the not knowing. I'm sure he didn't carry the suitcase the whole way to Belgrade himself. Yeah, he's certainly contributing his part. And this boy I saw often. Yeah, he liked to play football. The group. So there's a main concourse of the park. This concrete area where vans would go on there to distribute food, for example. But then when that was cleared, it would become an impromptu football pitch. That's where you saw me pictured with my bike before. Yeah, and the children came to know me, and yeah. He's a bit of a trendsetter, I guess, in 2015 to be wearing a medical mask. Yeah. The waiting, the not knowing, often showed on the faces, especially moments of peace and quiet. Yeah, so that was the selection of photographs I chose to show for this stream. There are many, many more, but they tell a similar story. And I also had a few pictures from a Vienna train station. So after being in Belgrade, I made my way up to the Vienna train, well, up to Vienna. So I cycled to Novi Sad, where I met with some friends of mine. It's about 100 kilometers, I think, from Belgrade. Quite an easy ride. And then from there, I went over Hungary, but I didn't see actually any of the migrants and the refugees crossing Hungary. But I did hear the stories afterwards. So they would often put people in these temporary, well, effectively prisons for a few days. And they always fed them pork sandwiches. Emphasized to me, always pork. You wonder why that is. You don't understand Muslim culture, but it's haram for them to eat pork, or not kosher for a Jewish person. This is a similar thing. It's a spitefulness. And I know a lot of lovely people in Hungary. The authorities don't represent that part of the culture that I know. And Orban remains leader in Hungary. And slanted all the way towards Putin and Russia. Bad on many fronts. And this was already visible in 2015. A lot of this didn't go said in the media quite as much as I felt should have been said. in terms of the severity and the harshness of the treatment of migrants in Hungary. It was said in general broad strokes, but there were some details missing. And the sanctions are being implemented against Hungary in terms of EU funding now. This is 10 years later. They started a few years ago, 8 years later. Too little, too late, really. There's a difference between how countries treated these migrants, whether it be Austria or Germany or Denmark or Sweden at the time. This is not to say everything is perfect. This is not to say that things couldn't be done better or that there's no upper limit to migration. Far from it. As I say, people died because of the lack of systems in place. There was problems with schooling of children initially, and still to this day. Like many countries, there's a teacher shortage in Germany. The money's there, but there's not the people to do the jobs. So there is an argument there with regards to limits. In terms of economics, a study a few years ago showed that the amount of money that the refugees from 2015 are now putting into the German country, the country of Germany, given that the demographic was relatively young, is more than they're taking out. So they're running a net positive now. So there isn't really the economic argument, but there is a social discussion to be had about integration. Integration goes both ways. It's about being welcoming, about being open-minded to saying, okay, you're from this background, but I don't know still who you are just because of your background. But also saying to people, if you want to live in a country that's a liberal democracy, that you have to ascribe to a sense and understanding that other people won't want to live the way that you want to live. In fact, they may also look down on the way you live to some extent, but that's okay as long as they don't impose that on you. And I had this discussion a week ago with people who are like-minded to myself, but they themselves are actually Muslim. What I would describe as liberal Muslims. And so we have to be pragmatic, realistic, and compassionate. And to an extent, many people and countries have done this, but there is more that can be done. And we should also reflect upon the fact that these conflicts and instabilities of the world, they're not going to go away anytime soon. So we can foresee in the future events of a similar nature and plan a little more. That worries me because I don't feel we're really doing that. And I feel that the discussion around migration in Europe has been one that's very lopsided towards the negatives and towards the lack of compassionate talk and discussion, and of course also in the US. And so it's not even about policy per se. You can say there's an upper limit and recognize that the people that you won't therefore be able to let in, it's tragic you can't do that. I'm sorry, but you can't come here. We don't have space. It's a sentence I don't really hear very often. It's more talking about them as statistics, as people, as not as people, but almost as below cattle, as if they're being too demanding to want to come to our countries that we seem to like so much as to want to keep the way they are. Well, then it should be understandable why any person who wants a good life would want to come to the US, to Germany, to Sweden, to Poland. And so it's about balance. But the world will never be perfect, and no country can help everybody in this world. And it's the good news stories that we should remember. So to put in perspective, and one last thing I want to show actually is I'm writing at the moment an article on what happened during this period. So as you can see, I mean, this graph is the main thing to take home here. Maybe make it a little bigger. So yeah, a simple flashback in numbers of discussing there's been two waves. The 2015 was this wave here. So many migrants were not classified as refugees. The refugees are the red line below, and that's included within the blue line. But many were, especially from Syria. But this has been dwarfed by 2022 and what's happened in Ukraine. The thing is, there's a third system now, which is not included here, where they're given like emergency right to stay in the EU. So they're not officially classified as refugees from Ukraine, but effectively are. And as you can see, that migration crisis is a crisis because it's a crisis for those who have to migrate. Effectively dwarfs what happened in 2015. So it was up to 4.8 million people came into the EU in 2015, whereas in 2022 that was up to 7 million. And this again still puts a strain. This puts a strain on the system, but the social discussion, the cultural discussion is not quite there, because people perceive Ukrainians as more like us, as people would say. But and maybe there's some truth to that. But everyone is human, and the limiting factor is the practical factor. So I think I'm going to round the stream up here. It's a bit of a somber one, but it's some good news to take home from this, I think. And you know, there was a lot of warmth and care from many of these people in these camps. I'd have tea at night with many of them, dance with them, play football, eat with them. And yeah, and now I remember them. And I'm in contact, as I say, with a number of different people. So in Norway and Sweden, with Walid, the brewer. Emmet, not so much anymore. And this family of very bright adults now, the children of the family, living in Berlin. And yeah, they're all happy, good, you know, beautiful stories. And that's a compliment to what Germany did. The consideration that was given. And also, we shouldn't forget to thank Angela Merkel for daring to be that considerate. Not every leader, I think, would have done that. So a reminder that democracy does matter, that who we elect does matter. Not every Chancellor of Germany would have done what Merkel did. And our new Chancellor of Germany, Merz, was very much against what Merkel did. Same party, different politics. And I don't know how that bodes for the future in terms of how much Germany would help in a similar situation. So let's keep hold of the good that's happened, not the bad, of what more could have been done. Hindsight's a very good teacher, but you have to see things in perspective at the time about effort and realizing what can be done. So thank you for watching either the stream or this video after the stream. Please like and subscribe to the channel. I'm still finding my feet with streaming and making videos. Yeah, there's a whole host of topics I want to stream on, make videos on. I think going back to some of these journeys, they're good focal points for broader discussion. I'm not going to shy away from political discussion, including on these trips. And if that means you're not interested in watching, then so be it. But give me a chance. And comment in the comments if you disagree with me in my position. That's another aspect, a key tenet of my beliefs. We need to talk more. If we disagree, we need to talk about this and respect each other's position. And if that happens, I think a lot of positive things can come from that. But I don't believe in the cancel culture of shutting people down because you disagree, or even find what each other has to say is almost repulsive or nonsensical. You may think what I have to say is nonsensical, and I respect that. That's a fair point to have, fair position to have. Yeah, so thank you again for watching, and hopefully I'll see you around for the next stream. And yeah,